themselves in a complete open manner, perhaps more than open manner at times, I would say. Um, and in addition to all of that, the thing that I find totally astonishing is that in this 60-year time span that they've been together, not only have they lived together and been open together and done everything, they have worked together. They have never really spent any time apart. And the fact that they have not killed each other by this point in time, I think I don't know how they have done it, quite frankly.
Yeah,
And I talk openly about all that, more so with Frank now. But I'm a jabberbox, so there are very few secrets between them and me. so I just find it astonishing, and I know it's nothing that I could have done. so I'm in complete awe of all of that.
I agree with that. That is quite an accomplishment.
No, it really is a 24/7 relationship for 60 years, the likes of which I don't know another. There's nothing to compare it to that I'm aware of.
Right. So how did you meet them?
Well, I met them. I met them through my first partner, who Lane and I were together for 30 years. I was 30 years old when I met him. He was 21 years older than me. And we were together 30 years before he was killed in an accident. And that was now 10 years ago. So within the first week of meeting him, it was in the middle of the summer. And at that point in Chicago, there were some French restaurants that did Bastille Day celebrations. So that was one of our first dates, if you will. And Lane was a longtime friend of Frank and Richard's. I'm not exactly certain how long, but I think they'd known each other for more than 10 years by the time I appeared on the scene. And within the first week of knowing Lane, Frank and Richard were on the scene. They joined us for one of these Bastille Day dinners. And then we continued. I'm sure if you spend any time in their presence, you know about the dinner parties, which were over the top. And the only dinner parties that were more over the top than Frank and Richard's were the ones hosted by Lane. And Frank readily admits that Lane was the impetus for Frank to start cooking, just so that they would be able to reciprocate. And it then became sort of a friendly competition, if you will. And the more complicated, the better. So these are the only people I know that would look for the most complex recipes and just jump in with both hands and both feet and do it. The first dinner I helped Lane simply said, "I'm going to have a dinner party. Do you want to help me?" I had no idea what I was in for. He deboned a turkey that he then recreated with homemade sausage and injecting strips of ham. And the whole thing it looked like a turkey when it came to the table. It had the right shape, it still had the legs, but instead of carving, because there were no bones in it, so you simply cut through the entire carcass. And what came out was a spiral of designed. Wow. So intricate, I can't tell you. It was the only time I'd ever cooked in the process of preparing things, we used hammers, pliers, drills, and all that had to get run through the dishwasher.
Oh my God.
So, and then, any number of times we went to Frank and Richard's houses where there would be, in the city, we would limit the dinner parties to whatever would fit into people's houses or condos, maybe as many as 10 people. Frank and Richard had no such limitations because they always lived on properties large enough that in the winter, the parties were confined to the dining table. In the summer, it could be cast of hundreds, and was at times. There was one time when they lived on the in the house out in the middle of nowhere in Lanark, that they had more than 100 people for a sit-down dinner.
Really?
Wow.
It was a combination, two women's birthdays. I remember who the people were, and I don't remember what ages they were, but I think the two numbers added together was 125, and I think that's how many guests there were.
Really?
and it wasn't just the food. Then your uncle would have done the flower arrangements, and it never stopped. It just the detail was carried out to the nth degree. And this was at the time when they were hot and heavy in the antique business, so they always had those large portable sort of tent-like structures that they would haul out to the antique shows. Well, one time we arrived in Lanark and there was no sign of any dinner party about to happen in the house. The house was as it always was. And we sat on the terrace and had way too many drinks. And then they said, okay, well, now for the dinner, we're going to walk through the pastures. So we walked down, one of them had mowed a path. And so we walked considerable distance from the house where one of these, or maybe several of those tents had been erected. And I called it the fairy palace because they had run extension cords from the house in through the tall grass so you couldn't see it. And the inside of the tent was filled with literally thousands of Italian lights. And the flower arrangements practically went to the top of the tent. So, there was an enormous table that I'm sure there must have been 30 people at that table, and a sideboard, and then heaps of food, all of that having been trucked out there by the two of them. It's unbelievable.
Wow.
And it was from the very first time we were introduced to the house in Lanark. I don't know if you ever saw it in the initial stage, but it never had running water in it, and it had not had electricity, had not been occupied for like 40 years, except by an errant cow every now and then would break in and walk through, but nobody had lived in it for all that time. And there was a decrepit mobile home trailer in the front yard. And so the first dinner party that we were invited to, we were instructed to arrive at a certain hour, like 5 or 6, as the sun was beginning to lower. And then we were, again, they kept us all on lawn chairs outside because the house was really a mess at that point. But as it got darker, suddenly the house lit up in that they had probably 50 candles in this one room. And the dinner was served in that dining room in an otherwise completely derelict structure, all of the food having been put together in the house trailer and then carted to the dining room. And again, flower arrangements, unbelievable. And we have pictures of some of that stuff. And I know they have photographs of some of those events, including that night. But it was an event the likes of which you could only experience in the most bizarre Hollywood film. And they pulled that off time and time and time again.
And they always did that, just the two of them. They didn't have any help.
Yes.
Wow.
And in that, these dinners were so complicated that there would be, 5, 6, 8 courses, whatever. Well, you can imagine the volume of dirty dishes at the end.
Yeah.
They would put that stuff in the car and drive it back to St. Charles. It was easier. It was easier to clean it up back at home rather than deal with it in a house without. You just cannot imagine the amount of energy that went into those things. I was a young kid at that point, and they could exhaust me in a matter of minutes. And they were always, I would have to say, they were very understated about what they had, all these back details where you never heard about it. And you knew that, even just making the flower arrangements could have easily taken a day.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah.
There was nothing simple about how they did anything.
Yeah.
And of course, your uncle's energy level was unmatched. You know, he just would go, he never went to sleep that we knew of, or if he did, it was, you know, after 2 a.m. And then he'd be up, you know, the first one up doing the next 5 projects. He, you know, Frank had some limits to his energy, but Richard never did.
Yeah.
Wow.
They mentioned
That's
that, well, first of all, they mentioned that Frank said, well, I wasn't a cook, or I wasn't I never hosted dinner parties before, but our friends would put these on. And so he decided that he was going to learn those skills. And I think what
And
you talked
he's
about.
self-taught.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
He also
Yeah.
mentioned that they would like to bring, they always like, well, sometimes they would, but they'd like to bring, like they say, gays and straights together for
Oh,
this event.
always. Yes. Unlike anybody I've ever known.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah. And they would do it with the greatest of ease. You know, they had that ability to put people who would be together in no other context in life.
Yeah.
You know, and somehow they made it work. And I think that's part of Frank's nephew's fascination with them. All of us have for years thought that nephew he may be latently gay, or he may be asexual. Who knows what he is? I mean, he's retirement age now, and he's never really been in a significant relationship. He is a therapist, I think, adores them and is in complete awe of them, in that they have never, I know of no one that has ever intimidated either one of them. There are people they don't like, but that doesn't mean that they wouldn't interact with them.
Right.
And do so with a state of dignity and kindness to some degree. And I think this nephew is completely mesmerized by that, because he really doesn't, I don't know if he has any friends, or he doesn't have very many friends, if he has any, and is a therapist by profession. So I think a lot of us have experienced these bizarre combinations that they would pull together, and wonder, I know for sure I would never be able to pull some of that stuff off. And I was Lane and we had very different lives. We came from completely different backgrounds, but we were a good yin and yang for each other. He was the calm, polite, sedate one. I'm anything but that on any of those fronts. But it worked for us because, he could be the one behind the scenes getting all that stuff together, and I could be the circus leader of the day, the day of the big events. Frank and Richard seemed to be much more ambidextrous. They could both do all aspects of all of those things. Frank was more quietly working in the background, but then when the dinners were over, your uncle would be the one that would clean it up. Frank would just go to bed. Frank would be so exhausted, he would just collapse. And your uncle would stay up all night doing dishes. And then often those dinner parties, especially when they were in Lanark, there was a core group of about 10 of us who were involved in these over-the-top dinners. And about it was essentially 5 couples. That's not exactly true, but just for simplicity, we'll say 5 couples. And about 7 of those people were cooks. Wow. 3 or 4 of us were not. 3 or 4 of us were the background people. But so several things. One is, I think it's amazing that all of us didn't weigh 500 pounds at the end, because it was all Julia Child, butter and cream recipes. But we didn't do it that often. And they would always justify it by saying, well, yes, there were 4 dozen eggs in this, but we had 10 people. So do the math, it still was a hell of a lot of cholesterol we were consuming.
Right.
But, oh, I think Beth froze again.
You know, I think like when I was a child and going to their hair salon, and they had all these older ladies coming to get their hair done every week. I have this feeling that they were so likable that
Mhm.
people didn't really care that they were gay, or it took people's mind off of it. I don't know how it worked.
Well, and they, with the two of them, not only were they gay, they were very gay.
Yeah, right.
And so I think it became, in that hair business, it became almost an entertainment for a lot of those people, because it was a floor show. If you went to that salon,
Yeah.
there were cocktails, there was coffee, there was, music at all times. And then over the course of time, it became a combination hair salon and antique business.
Yeah.
And so, they were able to cross many different bridges with their personalities and with how they ran things. It was a whole experience to go into that place.
Yeah. No, it was a lot of it, energy there, excitement, and a cast of different people who worked there, and
Yeah,
and this is
exactly.
my memories from when I was a young kid. So,
Yeah.
but and yeah, you're right. That it is amazing. They worked together that whole time.
That I find is the most astonishing part of the whole story,
Yeah.
from that perspective. And that, Lane and I never lived together. We were together 30 years, but we maintained separate residences. We would yo-yo back and forth from, we were often together for days on end,
Yeah.
but we didn't live under the same roof. And I think that's how we got to 30 years, quite frankly.
Okay. Yeah.
But Frank and Richard were, I've never known anybody who was together as much as the two of them have been for
Yeah.
that course of time,
And
and still today.
Well, even today, I mean, when you hear them talk about each other, they're so, complimentary of each other, and they speak to the skills that each one has. They
And
highlight
yet,
the highlights.
when you are really know them well,
Yeah.
then it took me years to finally figure this out. But they each have their own survival techniques within that relationship as well.
Okay.
And it often it revolves around the hours they keep. So Richard would stay up until 2 a.m. Frank goes to bed at 7 or 8 o'clock at night. Frank is up for the day by 4:30 or 5 at the latest, and Richard would sort of surface later. So they each had a chunk of 2 or 3 or 4 hours to themselves. And I came to realize that was a key component to camaraderie. Because before I figured that out, I just couldn't imagine how this didn't erupt into complete chaos and a divorce at some point. But then I came to understand that on a daily basis, they figured out this sort of symbiotic timing thing, so that it allowed them the opportunity to have a fresh start each day.
Yeah. I also asked them one time, because about going back, but looking in the 80s and 90s when HIV became so prevalent, and what it was like for them during that time. And they didn't. I mean, they said they lost a lot of friends, or but they didn't go into depth about that time. And so I'm just curious, your thoughts about that.
I think, quite frankly, I think that dinner party, that group of 10 of us who did those dinner parties, we probably saved one another's lives, quite frankly, because we were all in some we each were in either a serious relationship or at least a modest relationship that were relatively exclusive, and our socializing was really with that group of people, and we only really socialized in the context of those dinner parties. I know for a fact that years later it became evident to me that even members of my own family, because I'm not as open and out as the two of them, but I'm pretty transparent, I think.
Yeah, right.
And so everybody, as it turns out in my family, assumed that these sort of sleepover dinner parties were wild sexual orgies, which they were not. There was none of that.
Right.
But I think those relationships that we had with one another were very significant, and I stopped keeping track of people who from my circles who passed away in the era of AIDS when the number exceeded 50. I couldn't write down anymore.
Really? Oh my
And
God.
and they never really talked too much about it, but I think it was because they were somewhat exempt from it. None of us were bar people. None of us were on the prowl. We were with people that we wanted to be with, and we were grateful for it.
Right.
And so, I've thought about that myself over the course of time, and it was simply a fluke of good fortune that I had fallen into that group, because otherwise I would have been a statistic and a panel on the AIDS quilt. I'm sure of it. And
So
Lane was a very compassionate, beyond description person, and he ended up personally sewing. I think it was more than 10 of those panels for people who had dropped out of his life.
Wow.
And for years, when they would have that thing on display, when the quote would be on display at the mall, Lane and I would go to Washington every fall.
Wow.
And often we would be taking another panel.
Yeah, right.
It was a whole time period that, I was in my 30s. They were in their 50s, and some of the dinner party group would have been in their 60s, I guess, when that started happening. But it was less shocking for some of the older people to be losing friends, but I was losing friends who were contemporaries or younger. So out of that 50, the list of 50 people that I kept until I couldn't do it anymore, I would say the vast majority were under 35 years of age.
Right. So you guys had your own little, like we think of COVID, your own little bubble then.
We were a bubble. In
Yeah.
a bizarre sense, we were a bubble, and I think that allowed us to be here today. And of that group of 10 people, of the group in the dining group, we're down to 3 now: Frank and Richard and me. Everybody else is gone.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm now 70, so I was always the youngest of the of this crowd. Which I'm not young anymore. So it's 87, 85, and 70 now. Those are the 3 of us. And my partner lived until he was 81 when he was killed. Hi, Beth, you're back.
I'm so sorry. I'm gonna try and move rooms. I don't know why I keep getting disconnected. I apologize.
And one by one, several of that group were lost. I guess the majority of them were lost to chronic disease. Some couple had cancer, and one had Parkinson's and a stroke. Elaine was killed in a bicycling accident. And through it all, I have grown closer. I was always close with Frank and Richard, but through the departure of the rest of them, I have grown even closer to them. So,
Yeah.
and it's of some distress to me. I don't, you can edit this part out, but I'll tell you, if you haven't figured it out already, they're in a money crunch, big time,
Right.
but seem to be doing okay. They have some people who are advising them, and I know nothing about the gory details, but I tried to do everything within my power to help them, but in the end, it was not possible to do. I offered to buy their house and allow them to live in it, to give them that money, but that would have disqualified them for some of the public assistance that they have access to now. So, I have assured them over and over that if push comes to shove and they need help, all they have to do is pick up the phone and I would help them.
Right.
But I think you both know them well enough to know it would have to be pretty damn dire for them to make that phone call. And right now, I'm assured that they're doing okay. So I try to, and I think they would be, if they would be transparent with anybody, I think they would be transparent with me
Okay.
if they got to a point where they needed help.
Yeah, right. Yeah, they
It's a
didn't share that with us, so yeah.
Yeah. Well, that they won't. I'm sure they
Yeah.
won't.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Did you ever end up taking trips with them? Because I know they
Not
talked
so
about-
much because they were, we did short, overnight trips a few times,
Yeah.
but they always, they were always packed full. They worked until late in life, and then they were, those antique shows were killers. It was the equivalent of moving a household of stuff.
Yeah.
And they did that well beyond the age that they were, able to do it independently. So then they had to hire a lot of that, help to get that done. And ultimately, the time that I think they were depending on that income to get them to the end, but then the antiques market crashed. And it crashed when they were, when their health situations were beginning to wane as well. So it was bad timing on several fronts.
Okay.
And Frank was ready to give it up long before Richard. Richard was insistent that they keep going. And then ultimately, I think it was, my take on their situation is Frank had a better business mind and he would call the shots.
Yeah.
Richard didn't want to give anything up. That was sort of making a concession to old age, which was not his strong suit. And as Frank has said to me numerous times in the last couple of years, Richard is not doing old age well. And I think that's a very true statement. He has really had a lot of difficulty accepting his new reality.
Yeah, right. Did you ever get to know any of the other family members? The other family members?
Well, we knew your father.
Yeah.
And we we knew your father for a long time as just Richard's twin.
Right.
And then, as time went on with Richard's twin, then the colorful aspects of his life became transparent. And I don't remember that guy's name, the florist, the boyfriend florist.
Oh yeah,
Jim, yes. So then Jim and your father ended up appearing at some of those dinner parties, and there were a few winter weekends that the two of them and Lane and I would descend on the house in Lanark and go cross-country skiing and do stuff like that. Jim and your dad were more outdoorsy. Frank and Richard were never really big on physical exertion. I mean, they would work themselves to death, but in terms of things like cross-country skiing, no. So Frank would stay in the house and cook, and Richard would, have 6 projects going on, and your dad and Jim and and Lane and I would go. They had a lot of land when they first moved out there, like, I don't know, 30, 40 acres. And we would go on cross-country skis for a few hours back just on their own land. It was like having your own private resort. So,
Yeah.
but we didn't. And then your dad moved to Texas. And then I think after he moved to Texas, maybe we saw him once, but maybe not. I don't even remember. And then his health started crashing. And so we would hear stories about all that,
Right.
but then we lost track.
Yeah.
What year did your father die? I've lost track of that.
So it was, oh gosh, do you remember, Blair? Was it?
No, I'm not good at this, but. So you,
think
80, it would have been 87, right? So he died at 79. So it was 8 years ago.
Okay, yeah, I was thinking it was about this. It was not long after Lane was killed in his accident, but his health had already been on the dive for, with all that cancer stuff at the end. I remember
Yeah.
that went on for some period of time.
He was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And
Right.
so then he moved in with me in Fort Worth for the last year of his life.
And Frank and Richard did go to Texas once, I think, to see him, if I remember right. Yeah, which was a big deal because they never really traveled that much. Yeah, if it wasn't an antique show, they didn't do it. So,
Yeah, so it was good that they came. And
yeah.
so, yeah.
Yeah, it
And
is.
Jim,
Oh, go ahead.
Jim recently passed from cancer. I think it was last year. So.
And Frank and Richard made sure I knew that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but we saw Jim a couple years ago when we were in Chicago. It was nice. We got to see him.
Uh-huh. Well, I'm happy. We were always happy that they had found one another because they had similar lives. They had kids, they had wives, they had all that stuff, but they ended up having a relationship that worked for them, or at least it appeared to. So I was always happy on their behalf. So for that.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there were agonizing parts for Richard. Some of that was agonizing in that he was always so out, and made no excuses or concessions about it. And he always, I don't know if it was true or not, but he always felt like your father was more favored by at least your mother, by the grandmother, by his mother. And maybe wouldn't have been the case if the whole story had been known. But, they didn't, none of that stuff did they belabor, but they did talk about it from time to time. And I know it was something that they had thought about. So, but I never saw your dad and Richard ever talk about it. That it was just kind of, I think when they did talk about it, it was a very private conversation.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that they said that they became closer after my dad came out. And
Yeah, and that would have made total sense to me. I mean, that if you wanted a guide for this lifestyle, I can't imagine anybody better than Frank and Richard. And really they were, I don't know how many of the details you're aware of, but it was long before I knew them. I met them in 1980. And considerably before that, they had picked up and moved from St. Charles to Mineral Point, Wisconsin, a teeny tiny little town that was not ready for two out gay men running a hair salon. And they really had some pretty scary confrontations in that town, and ultimately kind of got run back to St. Charles. They liked it. They liked the town, and they loved the house that they had, but it was, Mineral Point was not ready for them. Times have changed. My partner, I'm in a relationship now with a guy from South America, and we're seriously watching the real estate market in Mineral Point, thinking that we would move there if the right house opened up. And now there's a gay mayor.
Really?
And they have a pride parade. But none of that was. I attribute some of how that is today to the fact that Frank and Richard opened those doors.
Right.
That's great.
Yeah, they never mentioned that about Mineral Point. They never.
Yeah,
never
well,
said more about
it took
that.
a long time for them to talk to any of us about it, because I
Yeah.
think it was a really scary time. And did you ever see their house? Well, they had numerous houses, but the big final house where they had the hair salon was one of the more prominent homes in town, and it was directly across the street from the elementary school.
Oh.
And those kids tormented them like crazy. I mean, just horribly, as only elementary school kids could.
Right.
And, would just harass the shit out of them. So,
Right.
yeah,
I think, Beth, we've been to that house. We were at
I
that
think
house. weren't we?
so.
that was the Cawthorn House, which is the name of the antique business.
Yeah, right. Right.
We have pictures from there.
But
And then they sold that house to a straight couple who then continued the dinner party thing. So for years, some of us would be invited to Mineral Point, Frank and Richard included, for New Year's Eve parties.
oh,
But of course, Frank and Richard would always have to work until like 4 o'clock that afternoon. So
Sure.
we would be driving on New Year's Eve night with all the drunks getting to the Mineral Point party and one year we went off the road in a snow drain in a horrible snow condition, and it was after midnight by the time we finally got there.
really? Oh my gosh. Oh my God.
Nothing would stop them or the rest of us.
Yeah, right.
If there was a party and you were invited, you would just go, no matter what.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah. So
Well,
I think they told us so you go with your partner Oliver to spend some time is it
In
he
Colombia.
from Colombia?
Yeah, he's from Colombia. He's a dual citizen, and he designed and built a house down there. He has been in the States 35 years. He's 71 and I'm 70. He's off to the gym now, or otherwise I'd have him pop his head in here. But we have a house in the coffee country in the mountains overlooking the Andes. And then we have a condo on the Caribbean in Santa Marta.
Nice.
Unfortunately, we've been down there the last 5 winters. I've been retired 8 years and he's been retired 6 years. And we've gone down there I've gone down for 3-month stays. He's a dual citizen, so he can stay as long as he wants.
Yeah.
I can only stay for 3 months without a visa.
Yeah.
I came back last year in February. I go down in November, come back in February. He was going to come back in April. And I called him in early March and I said, April is not going to work. You need to get an earlier ticket because things are happening. So he got a ticket for late March, but 3 days before he was to fly, the government closed the airports without warning. And he was stuck for 7 months until October.
Really?
Before he could come back.
Wow.
And so we don't have any plans to go because it's still too dicey. There's still, vaccines are only just beginning, and they're mainly the Chinese ones, and there's also civil unrest. So anyway, I think we're here until things open up a bit more.
Oh, that's
But-
tough.
There's so many of those stories of people stranded in different places.
It was unbelievable. We never in our wildest dreams did we think he would be stranded for 7 months. So
All right.
yeah, that was not good. Thank God for WhatsApp. We were able to,
Yeah.
communicate, be in touch, but that leaves quite a bit to be desired
Yeah,
after a few weeks. That's not good either. So anyway, in parting, I will say it's my intention, and Oliver is as enamored with Frank and Richard as I am. So it's our intention to sort of be at the ready to do anything we can to help them at this stage in life.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you're well aware that if anything should happen to Frank,
Yeah.
Richard is going to have to be moved immediately because he is completely dependent upon Frank for everything right now.
Right.
So, we'll just see how it plays out. And
Yeah, and feel free to keep in touch with us if there's
I
anything.
will, now that I have your emails, I will do that.
Yeah, I mean, that was a real shock when Frank had the heart attack and
Yeah.
like,
Well,
what
and
happened, you know?
And, quite frankly, anything could happen to either of them any day. And if something happens to Frank, well, then it's going to be instant turmoil.
Mhm.
Yeah. And
And if
how were they when you saw them this week?
they were okay. Okay. I would say, have you seen them lately?
The last time I saw
Some
them
in July.
we saw them in July. Yeah.
Yeah, both of us got in the car, and as we were driving away, we both turned to each other and said, Richard seems unchanged. He hasn't really, this was, I think, the fourth or fifth time that we visited them I would say in the last calendar year, when he never leaves his chair the entire time we're there. So that's just how it is. Frank is the one who is changing more rapidly now. Frank is aging before your eyes, but I'm not surprised by that because Frank is carrying all the workload.
Right.
So, and he really never complains, but he will confide in me if I'm able to pry information out of him. I know when to call and how to ask the questions. And so I can get him to be pretty open with me about his own health situations, and they're significant.
Yeah.
So, all I can just say is I won't be surprised to hear anything at any point.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, please keep in touch and
I will do that. I will
Yeah,
do that.
please.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Beth, anything else?
no, it was just so nice to meet you and hear your stories.
Likewise. And if I think of any blast from the past that I think you need to know, I'll shoot a fast email to you. And, if there are other things that come to mind that you want more information, set up another Zoom or give me a call or whatever. I'll be happy to tell you what I do or don't know.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank
All
you
right.
so much.
Mark, if you ever want to come on safari in Tanzania, let me know. Okay.
That might, who knows, that might happen.
Right.
We're footloose and fancy free now. We just, I'll clue you in as to how we're spending our time now. We're both we've both had health issues, but nothing terribly serious. Well, Oliver had a brain aneurysm, so that was terribly serious. But he lived through the repair surgery, and that was now 5 years ago. So, and so we are now in a point where we're realizing, okay, if we want to do any of these challenging adventures, now is the time to do it while we're both able. So we signed up for a 5.5-day hiking expedition in August, transitioning into September, the last few days of August and the first couple of days of September. And we hiked with a backroads group. We hiked almost 50 miles in 5.5 days and climbed 5,800 feet in glacier.
Really? Wow.
And it was just, we had neither one ever done any of those organized trips like that before. And we were very thrilled to do it. And we were probably the oldest people on the group, but most importantly, we were not the slowest. So anyway, I think we're going to be looking at more such adventures in the next few years. So
where was that?
Where
did you do that hike?
in Glacier National Park,
Glacier National Park.
on the Montana Canadian border.
Okay.
And the only disappointment was we were supposed to spend 2 days in Waterton, which is the Canadian, it was a twin peace park with Waterton abutting Glacier. But because of COVID and the border closed, we couldn't do that part.
Right.
So one of the things we have in the back of our heads is in the next year or two, maybe going back and doing it again once the border is definitely open because I would like and it was lovely. They were day hikes that then they would pick us up with wine and beer in the available in the vans at the end of the trail, and then cart us off to, a very nice historic national park hotel for showers, sleeping, and dinner, and then next day all over again. So it was very cushy. I loved it. So
That's great.
Sounds wonderful.
yeah, it was. Do it before you get 70 years old, though, would be my advice. Anyway, nice to meet you
Thanks,
both.
Mark. Have a good day.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.
You too.
Bye.
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 Okay, so let me